After dabbling with Vocaloid, Kikuo actually goes on to play more with instrumentals. He releases his first album, his first entry into the Kikuo World series, which is, fittingly enough, Kikuo World One. This was released right at the tail end of the year, December 31st, 2011. Can't get much closer to the edge than that, right? Kikuo World One is a much more personal album than what he had released up to that point. All of his experimentation and his ideas are just thrown onto these albums, and they kind of paint a clear portrait of what he's capable of when it comes to production, and this album is much better than Kikuo Miku 1, in my opinion. I think that this is...
Just kidding, it's trash!
I feel like this album is better because it's more representative of the skills that he has. Fittingly enough, the name Kikuo World is pretty accurate also. Not only do I feel like I'm transported into his world, but I feel like I'm being transported into a different world as a whole. Now, the Kikuo World series doesn't actually have the same 20-30 second intro tracks that are sprinkled all throughout Kikuo Miku and Kikuo Hana. It actually just has a full 2-minute song at the beginning, which is nice. This album is, in my opinion, Kikuo's first masterpiece. I wouldn't call it a perfect album necessarily. There are problems with it that I'm going to go into more in detail later, but I think that this is the first time that he really hit an artistic peak. This album, Kikuo World One, is a very atmospheric album. You're going to hear a lot of house beats, a lot of lo-fi chill beats to help you study, that sort of thing. You can feel Kikuo's touch, his wonky production style, on nearly every beat on this thing, for sure. It is loaded to the brim with personality and quirk. Right from the start of this album, you hear these weird clacking and clattering sounds as the synth crawls into formation. I truly feel as though I'm going uphill on a roller coaster. And then Kikuo kind of Thunder Mountains you, where it dips, right? It doesn't drop, but then it doesn't drop. It really gets you too, right? You know, just like in Thunder Mountain, where you're like, I'm gonna drop, and it's like, no, you ain't gonna drop. It doesn't drop yet. It keeps going. You're immersed into the environment and taking it in, right? Kind of observing the rocks and the grass and the little woodland critters. Kikuo is crazy about using samples all over this album, and it's very apparent even from the beginning. You hear it as 6 million ways to die, choose one. The way that the track is going up to this point, the xylophones and this killer, just throttling beat, it really feels like a train track, just kind of clacking away. And you're really getting into the vibe when all of a sudden the track just swells and explodes into this flurry of choral samples. It's truly a little bit too much when you first listen to it. It's very overwhelming. Sounds are just all around you. The production becomes heavenly, yet thunderous even. You have entered Kikuo's world by this point. The second track on this album sounds a bit like the snow level from Undertale, but these beautiful sampled vocals are all over the place, kind of chirping and plucking away. The piano passage, the 8-bit drums, it's like a soundtrack to a film that Kikuo puts you in. I'm in the movie. This is a theme that carries through the whole album, in my opinion, whether it's the sprite-like vocals kind of laughing and chirping throughout the third track, or moments like the frantic, gleeful, arpeggio piano passages of track number 5. Kikuo is express to give these rich and very dense passages of glee just kind of weave throughout there. It feels like a pretzel. There's a transition point, track number 6. Nice, quaint, and very brief. This is the first time that he has an interlude in the middle of an album. He kind of does that later on as well. And the track is very brief, but it leads into a song that isn't very brief because it's very long in how much I like it. It's called Ankyo, or Screaming in the Dark for people who like to pronounce things correctly. It begins with this eerie, ghostly synth that explodes into this climactic, screaming synth. The energy only dies down to build itself back up even stronger and harder. It's incredible. The amount of dominance that this one instrument carries in the track is unbelievable. What I like the most about this track is that it really isn't one note. The other instruments are all working in tandem with each other. The shots of trumpet, bass guitar kind of jamming out at the end, the xylophone, piano just hammering chords at you, the guitar just kind of chugging away. A melody so simple, so rich, so emotionally potent. Honestly, words fail to convey how this track makes me feel. I could listen to this track 100 times and I am just there for all of it. Like, where the hell was this Kikuo on his initial project? I don't know. It was only like, what, 4 months? August, September, October, November. 5 months or so since the first project, and this is already sounding like a completely different artist. The production here is not to be laughed at. This is a very low budget project, and at times, I guess you can feel it, honestly. There's no real like attempt to convince you that each of these instruments is fully live, but the way that they're mixed with one another just really makes tracks like this stand out in your mind. It's so ghostly sounding, it's so harrowing, it's so intense, it's so melodically blissful, if I were to put it into words. I would call this track a bit repetitive. I mean, it's a bit longer than the other tracks in the listing, but I think what keeps it from being repetitive is the evolving production behind it. Every time you shift into one part of the song, it's always evolving. The next track is actually a reincorporation of a song that he had previously released on The Bell of the Dream. I'm so glad that he redid this song. The beat is so kickin'. It's great to put this song here, right here. We need this groovy cool down moment after what we had just experienced in the track before. The flow on this project is something that Kikuo definitely started to pay attention to more. This is more the case with this album than some of the subsequent albums. It's always been a bit of a weak point for him, if I'm being honest, when it comes to albums. Sometimes there's a little bit of filler, sometimes there's an emotion and he's kind of not sure where to dive or go higher with the emotional intensity of a track, so listening kind of gets muddy sometimes. But this is the point where he starts to kind of consider patience and people's tolerance for that sort of thing. Now, it's not perfect on this album by any means, but he noticed. He noticed. Thank God. Bless him. The final track sounds like a fucking Toontown remix. It's so cheesy. There are these very silly samples. There's a saxophone. And while this track is a lot less consequential than others, it really doesn't prioritize itself in the track listing. I'd call the production smile-inducing. It's a very cute track. It's a bit too brief for my liking, but it's not horrible. The album as a whole is pretty brief too, and if I'm being honest, I think that there are some tracks in the listing that do meander a little bit. And with repeated listens, honestly, it's a lot harder to pick out these tracks from a listing. While on their own, every track here has something to say, I think that as a group, the highlights stand out way more than the ones that don't. I think he is pushing his boundaries with this album. In some places, he didn't push hard enough, far enough, but again, this is an amazing sophomore album, if I'm being quite honest with you. Truly one for the books. If you want an entry point into Kikuo Sans Vocaloid, I think this is a great entry point. But if you are a producer or you plan on producing music, you have to listen to this record. I want to hear 100 projects that sound exactly like this. Like, steal, copy, and cheat from this album so that I hear it more. Please. I'm gonna give Kikuo World One a 9 out of 10. While I think every track has great moments, I kind of wish at some points there was like a little bit more variety. But then again, I think that this album is just top notch. Honestly, like a 9. It's a 9 for a reason. It bumps. It really bumps. It really bumps. It really bumps. It really bumps.